Story 1. The Good Samaritan. The snow fell in thick, heavy flakes as Emily gripped the steering wheel tightly. She was looking forward to spending the holidays with her parents, who hadn't seen her in over a year. It would be a cozy, warm reprieve from the isolation of her small apartment in the city. But now the highway stretched endlessly, dark and desolate except for the occasional flicker of headlights far in the distance. Her phone buzzed with a low battery warning. She had left her charger at home in her rush to pack. "I'll be fine," she thought. "Just a little longer until the next town." But then, as if on cue, her car sputtered and slowed. The check engine light blinked angrily, and the vehicle came to a complete stop. "No, not now," she groaned, banging her hands on the steering wheel. She tried the ignition again and again, but the engine refused to turn over. Outside, the icy wind howled, pushing against the car like a phantom. Emily knew she couldn't stay here long. The temperature was plummeting, and her car would soon be an icebox. Reluctantly, she stepped out into the cold. She popped the hood and stared at the engine, though she had no idea what she was looking at. Her breath puffed out in white clouds as she scanned the empty highway for signs of life. And then she saw it, a pair of headlights in the distance. Relief washed over her as the vehicle approached. It was an old, beat-up pickup truck that pulled onto the shoulder behind her car. The driver stepped out, and Emily's relief turned to unease. The man was tall and wiry, his face mostly obscured by a wide-brimmed hat and a long scarf. He moved with an almost mechanical stiffness, his boots crunching on the icy road. "Need some help?" he called out, his voice rough but friendly enough. Emily hesitated but nodded. "Yeah, my car just stopped. I don't know what's wrong." The man didn't say much as he examined the engine, his movements methodical. "Alternator's shot," he said after a while, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You're not going anywhere tonight." Emily's stomach sank. "Is there a tow service nearby?" "Not this late," he replied. "I can give you a ride to the next town. It's only about 15 minutes from here." She hesitated. Something about him set her on edge, but what choice did she have? She glanced at her phone. No service. The wind bit at her cheeks, making the decision for her. "Okay, thank you." The truck's interior smelled of oil and damp leather. The passenger seat was cluttered with tools and empty soda cans, so she perched awkwardly on the edge, clutching her purse. The man started the engine and pulled onto the highway, the old truck groaning as it gained speed. At first, the drive was uneventful. Emily tried to make small talk, but the man gave short, disinterested replies. The radio crackled with static, and the heater barely worked. Then, without warning, the man veered onto a narrow, snow-covered road that disappeared into the woods. "This doesn't look like the way to town," Emily said, her voice trembling. "Shortcut," the man replied, not looking at her. The further they drove, the darker it became. The trees closed in around them, their skeletal branches forming a tunnel of shadows. Emily's unease grew into outright fear. "Can you stop?" "I think I left something in my car," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The man ignored her. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. "Please stop the truck," she demanded, her voice rising. The man finally turned to her, and for the first time, she saw his face fully. His eyes were cold and empty, and his mouth twisted into a sinister grin. "Why would I do that?" he asked. Emily's heart pounded as she reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The man had locked it. "You should have stayed in your car," he said, his tone mocking. The truck lurched to a stop in a clearing, and the man pulled a hunting knife from his coat. "Now, let's make this quick." Emily acted on pure instinct. She grabbed the nearest object, a rusty wrench from the floor, and swung it at his head. The man stumbled, cursing, and she used the moment to unlock the door and run. The cold air stung her face as she sprinted into the woods, branches tearing at her clothes. Behind her, she could hear the man crashing through the undergrowth, his footsteps steady and unrelenting. "You can't run forever," he called out. Emily didn't stop. She ran until her legs burned and her lungs felt like they would burst. Finally, she saw lights in the distance, a pair of headlights coming down another road. She stumbled out, waving her arms frantically. The car skidded to a stop and the driver, a woman, jumped out. "Are you okay?" she asked, catching Emily as she collapsed. "Help me," Emily gasped. "He's coming." But when they looked back at the woods, there was no sign of the man. The police found the pickup truck abandoned in the clearing, its engine still running. Inside, they discovered a collection of knives, rope, and duct tape. They searched the woods for days but found no trace of the man. Emily never made it to her parents' house that Christmas. She moved to a new city, changed her phone number, and tried to forget. But every winter she avoided highways, afraid of seeing a rusted pickup in her rearview mirror. End of the story. Story 2. The Flooded Bridge. The Peterson family was in high spirits as they packed their SUV for a long-awaited holiday getaway. Tom, ever the planner, double-checked their luggage while his wife Anna made sure their kids, Ellie and Jack, were buckled in. The cabin by the lake promised the perfect escape, peaceful, snowy, and away from the chaos of everyday life. "Are we there yet?" Ellie asked, her small voice filled with impatience. "Not yet, sweetie," Anna replied, twisting in her seat to smile at her daughter. "Just another hour or so." Tom chuckled. "You kids are worse than my GPS." The rain had started as a light drizzle, but quickly turned into a downpour. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up as Tom navigated the winding mountain roads. The river alongside them was swollen, the current growing stronger with every mile. Anna frowned, stealing a glance at it. "The water looks high." "It's just the rain," Tom said confidently, though his knuckles tightened on the steering wheel. By the time they reached the bridge, the rain was a relentless sheet of gray. The structure was narrow, barely wide enough for two cars, with rusted railings that offered little comfort. Below, the river raged, carrying broken branches and debris. "Do we have to cross that?" Ellie asked nervously. "We'll be fine," Tom assured her. But even as he spoke, doubt crept into his voice. The SUV rolled onto the bridge, the tires splashing through large puddles. Halfway across, a deafening crack echoed through the night. The bridge shuddered violently, and Tom slammed on the brakes. The family screamed as a section of the bridge collapsed, sending chunks of concrete plunging into the water. "Get out, now!" Tom yelled, unbuckling his seatbelt. The family scrambled to escape as water surged onto the bridge. Ellie clung to Anna, crying, while Jack struggled to open his door. Tom jumped out first, pulling Jack free, but the current tore at the SUV, dragging it toward the broken edge. "Anna, hurry!" he shouted, reaching for her. Anna managed to pull Ellie out just as the SUV tipped forward. They all plunged into the icy water. The current was impossibly strong, ripping them apart. Anna could hear her children screaming, but the sound was drowned out by the roar of the river. She clawed at the water, desperate to find them. "Ellie, Jack, Tom," she screamed, her voice hoarse. A piece of debris slammed into her, dragging her underwater. She kicked and thrashed, surfacing just long enough to catch a glimpse of Ellie clinging to a floating log. Jack was further downstream, struggling to swim. "Hold on!" Anna cried, but the current carried her away before she could reach them. Anna awoke on the riverbank, coughing and shivering. The rain had stopped, but the night was deathly cold. She stumbled to her feet, her body aching, and called out into the darkness. "Tom! Ellie! Jack!" There was no answer. The woods around her were silent except for the distant sound of the river. She wandered along the bank, searching for any sign of her family. Hours passed before she saw Ellie huddled under a tree. Tears streamed down her daughter's face as Anna pulled her into a tight embrace. "It's okay, baby. I've got you," Anna whispered, though her heart ached with worry for Tom and Jack. They continued searching, their voices hoarse from calling out. Just as dawn broke, they found Jack on the opposite bank, shivering but alive. A rescue team arrived soon after, alerted by another traveler who had seen the broken bridge. But Tom was nowhere to be found. The search for Tom lasted days. Rescue teams combed the river and its banks, finding fragments of the SUV and bits of debris, but no sign of him. Weeks later, as the snow began to melt, they discovered his wallet washed up on the shore, along with a torn piece of his jacket. The Peterson family held a memorial, but Anna refused to believe he was gone. "Sometimes people survive these things," she told herself. "Maybe he's out there, waiting for us to find him." Months passed, and the river began to reclaim its tranquility. The bridge was repaired, though locals spoke in hushed tones about the tragedy. On stormy nights, some claimed to see a figure standing on the rebuilt bridge, a man waving desperately for help before vanishing into the mist. Anna moved her family to a new home far from the river, but she could never escape the sound of rushing water in her dreams. She would wake in the dead of night, heart pounding, certain she heard Tom's voice calling her name. And on one particularly stormy evening, Ellie came to her mother's room, pale and trembling. "Mom," she whispered, "I saw Dad. He was outside my window. He was calling for me." Anna rushed to the window, but the yard was empty. Only the faint sound of rain and the distant river filled the air. To this day, the Petersons avoid bridges, and every time the storm clouds gather, Anna swears she hears Tom's voice in the wind, begging her to find him. End of the story. Story 3. The Highway of the Dead. The Daniels family had spent the last hour weaving through congested streets, their old station wagon groaning under the weight of hastily packed belongings. The city behind them was chaos. Fires burned in abandoned buildings, and screams echoed down alleyways. They had left everything behind except for what they could carry, desperate to reach the countryside where rumors suggested it was safer. Tom Daniels gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he navigated the gridlocked traffic. Beside him, his wife, Sarah, clutched their youngest child, Molly, who was crying softly into her mother's shoulder. In the back seat, their teenage son, Kyle, stared out the window, his face pale. "How much farther to the highway?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. "Not far," Tom replied, glancing at the GPS. "If we can just make it past this traffic, we'll be out of the city in no time." "Dad," Kyle said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Look." Tom followed his son's gaze. Down the road, a commotion was unfolding. A man was pounding on the window of an SUV, screaming for help. Before anyone could react, another figure lunged at him, dragging him to the ground. The man's screams turned into gurgles as the attacker tore into his flesh. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed, shielding Molly's eyes. Tom slammed the car into reverse, narrowly avoiding the vehicle behind him. He turned down a side street, his heart racing. The radio crackled with static before a robotic voice cut in. "Attention! Martial law is in effect. Do not engage with the infected. Seek shelter immediately." The infected. That was the term the news had been using all morning, but it didn't do justice to what they had seen. These weren't just sick people. They were monsters. As they neared the on-ramp to the highway, they encountered a blockade. Military vehicles were parked across the lanes, soldiers directing people to turn back. "Highways closed," one of them shouted, waving his rifle. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, panic creeping into her voice. Tom hesitated. Then he spotted a narrow maintenance road that cut through the woods and connected to the highway further down. It wasn't ideal, but it was their only chance. "Hang on," he said, turning sharply onto the dirt path. When they finally reached the highway, it was eerily empty. The wide stretch of asphalt, usually bustling with cars, was littered with abandoned vehicles. The stillness was unnerving, broken only by the distant sound of the wind. "This doesn't feel right," Kyle muttered. "We'll be fine," Tom said, though even he didn't believe it. He kept the car moving steadily, weaving around the scattered debris. But as they drove further, they began to see them, figures stumbling between the cars, their movements jerky and unnatural. "Tom, they're everywhere," Sarah whispered, her eyes darting to the figures that were slowly turning toward the sound of their car. "Stay calm," Tom said, accelerating. "They're slow, as long as we don't stop." A deafening bang cut him off. The car lurched as the front tire hit a piece of debris and blew out. Tom fought to keep control, but the station wagon skidded to a halt. "Everyone out!" he yelled, grabbing the baseball bat he had thrown into the back seat before they left. Kyle grabbed Molly's hand while Sarah clutched a tire iron. The family climbed out of the car, their breath visible in the cold air. The infected were closing in now, their hollow eyes fixed on their prey. "Run!" Tom shouted, swinging the bat as the first of the creatures lunged at him. Its jaw snapped hungrily, but Tom's bat connected with a sickening crack, sending it sprawling. The family sprinted down the highway, weaving between cars as the undead followed in a relentless tide. Molly was crying again, her small legs struggling to keep up. Kyle scooped her up, his heart pounding as he glanced back. The creatures were faster than they looked. "There!" Sarah pointed to an overturned delivery truck with its back door partially open. It was their only hope for shelter. The family scrambled inside, slamming the door shut, just as the infected reached them. The creatures clawed at the metal, their guttural growls filling the air. Inside the truck, the smell of spoiled food was overwhelming, but the family didn't care. They huddled together, catching their breath. "We can't stay here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We'll wait for them to move on," Tom replied, though he wasn't sure how long that would take. Hours passed, and the growling outside subsided. Tom peeked through a small crack in the door. The highway was still, but he knew better than to trust the silence. "We have to keep moving," he said. "If we can find another car." The family crept out of the truck, their makeshift weapons ready. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the highway. They moved cautiously, staying close together. Suddenly, a scream shattered the quiet. It wasn't one of them. It came from up ahead. A woman was running toward them, waving her arms. "Help me," she cried. Behind her, a swarm of infected poured over the horizon, dozens of them moving with terrifying speed. "Run!" Tom yelled, grabbing Sarah's hand. The family sprinted toward a nearby semi-truck, its cab door hanging open. They climbed inside just as the woman reached them. She tried to follow, but the infected were too fast. They pulled her down, her screams cut short as the horde descended on her. Tom slammed the door shut, locking it. Inside the cab, the family sat in stunned silence, their faces pale. Outside, the swarm surrounded the truck, their bloodied hands smearing the windows. "What now?" Kyle asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We wait," Tom said, though he wasn't sure how long they could survive. The undead didn't tire, and the highway stretched endlessly in both directions. As the night wore on, the family huddled together, listening to the sound of the dead, scratching at the walls of their metal prison. In the morning, they would make a plan. But for now, all they could do was pray the sun would rise. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour as the undead outside continued their relentless assault on the truck. Their growls and the rhythmic scratching of their nails against the metal were maddening. Inside, the Daniels family sat in tense silence, their breaths visible in the frigid air. "We can't stay here forever," Kyle said, his voice shaking. He clutched Molly tightly, shielding her from the grotesque shadows cast by the moonlight through the cracked windshield. Tom nodded grimly. At first light, we'll make a run for it. There's bound to be another car down the road. What if we don't make it? Sarah whispered, her hand trembling in her lap. Tom didn't answer. He couldn't bring himself to say the words, but they were all thinking it. This might be the end. As dawn broke, a faint, sickly orange light painted the highway. The undead were still there, though many had wandered a short distance away, shuffling aimlessly. Tom took a deep breath. Now. We go now. Carefully, they eased open the truck's door. The closest infected turned, its head snapping toward them with an unnatural jerk. Tom swung his bat hard, the sickening crack echoing as the creature fell. "Move!" he shouted. The family sprinted down the road, weaving through the maze of abandoned cars. The sound of their footsteps attracted more of the undead. Figures began to emerge from the wreckage, groaning and snarling. "Faster!" Tom yelled, but the creatures were gaining. Kyle, still carrying Molly, stumbled over a broken piece of guardrail. Molly screamed as they both went down, and Tom turned back to help. "Get up, Kyle! Now!" Before he could reach them, an infected woman lunged out from behind a car, sinking her teeth into Kyle's leg. He cried out in agony, dropping Molly. Sarah rushed forward, swinging her tire iron with desperate strength, but more creatures swarmed them. "Run, Molly!" Sarah screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Run!" Tom grabbed Molly and pulled her away as Kyle's screams turned to gurgles. Sarah didn't follow. She fought until she disappeared beneath the pile of clawing, snapping figures. "No!" Tom screamed, dragging Molly as she kicked and screamed for her mother. He ran blindly, his heart breaking with every step. They found temporary shelter in an overturned RV. Tom slammed the door shut and barricaded it with whatever he could find. He and Molly collapsed onto the floor, both of them shaking. "Mom and Kyle," Molly whispered, her voice trembling. Tom couldn't look at her. "We'll find help," he said, though the words felt hollow. "We'll be okay." Molly didn't respond. She hugged her knees, rocking back and forth. Hours passed. The highway was quieter now, though the occasional groan of the infected reminded them of the danger outside. Tom knew they couldn't stay long. He needed to find another vehicle, something that could get them far away from this nightmare. "Molly," he said softly, reaching out to touch her shoulder. "We need to go." She didn't move. Her small frame trembled as she kept her head down. "Molly," he said again, this time with more urgency. He turned her toward him, and his heart stopped. Her face was pale, her eyes bloodshot and unfocused. She opened her mouth, and a low, guttural growl escaped. Tom's eyes fell to her arm. There was a bite mark, hidden under her jacket sleeve. "No," he whispered, backing away. "No, no, no." Molly lunged at him, her small hands clawing at his face. Tom stumbled back, tears streaming down his face as he fought to hold her off. "Molly, it's me, it's Dad," he cried, but there was no recognition in her eyes. With a heavy heart, Tom grabbed the bat. He hesitated, his hands shaking. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." The RV rocked violently as the infected outside, drawn by the commotion, began pounding on the walls. Tom raised the bat, tears blurring his vision. He swung, the sound of the impact drowning out his sobs. The pounding on the RV grew louder. The undead were breaking through. Tom sat on the floor, the bat falling from his hands as the reality of what he had done consumed him. He didn't move as the door gave way, the infected flooding inside. He didn't fight. He didn't scream. On the highway, the sun set once again, casting long shadows over the endless sea of broken cars and wandering corpses. The Daniels family was gone, and the highway claimed another set of victims. The road stretched on, an eternal blood-soaked monument to humanity's downfall, a highway of the dead where no one escaped. End of the story.